The battlefield was silent now. The sounds of explosions, gunfire, and shouting had faded into the distance. Smoke and dust still hung in the air, making it hard to see. The ground was covered in craters, broken weapons, and bodies, both human and Vorkari. Serica lay among them, her breathing weak. Pain spread through her body, sharp and unbearable. A deep wound ran across her side, and her left arm refused to move. Her blood, dark and thick, stained the dirt beneath her. She had failed. The Vorkari Empire had ordered her squad to attack the human outpost at dawn. It was supposed to be a simple mission: strike fast, destroy the enemy, and return to base. But the humans had fought harder than expected. They were outnumbered, yet they refused to surrender. Serica had admired their courage for a brief moment. Then the fighting had begun. Now she was the only one left. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't listen. Her breathing grew shallow, her vision blurred. She knew what this meant. She was dying, and no one would come for her. The Vorkari never saved the wounded. A warrior who could not stand was useless. Her squad had retreated without her, just as she had been taught to do. This was the way of her people: leave the weak behind, focus on victory. Serica had always believed in that rule. Until now. She felt anger, not at her squad, but at herself. She had trained for years, fought in many battles, and yet here she was, broken, alone, forgotten. She closed her eyes. Maybe it was better this way. But then, footsteps, soft, cautious steps, moving through the wreckage. Serica forced her eyes open, her heart pounding weakly. Was it a Vorkari soldier? No, they would not return for her. Was it a human? If so, they would finish her off. The figure stepped closer. A human male, wearing a dusty uniform and a helmet with a cracked visor. He held a rifle, but it wasn't aimed at her. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, his expression unreadable. Serica tried to reach for her own weapon, but her fingers barely twitched. She was too weak to fight. The human knelt beside her. He studied her for a moment, then let out a small sigh. "You're still alive," he murmured. Serica flinched. His voice was calm, not filled with hatred or anger. It confused her. The human set his rifle down and reached into a pouch. Before she could react, he pulled out a small medical kit. What was he doing? Serica glared at him. "Leave me," she managed to whisper. The human ignored her. He pulled off his gloves and carefully pressed a bandage against her wound. She gasped in pain but didn't have the strength to resist. "You're lucky," he said, securing the bandage. "The wound is deep, but you might survive if you don't move too much." Serica stared at him in disbelief. A human, helping her. It made no sense. Humans and Vorkari were enemies. They killed each other without hesitation. That was the rule of war. Yet here he was, saving her life. "Why?" she whispered. The human glanced at her. His eyes were tired, but there was no hatred in them. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I don't like leaving people to die." Serica didn't understand. Vorkari believed in strength above all else. If someone was weak, they were left behind. It was simple. It was necessary. Humans were different. Serica studied him carefully. He wasn't much older than her, maybe in his mid-20s. His uniform was torn, his hands were rough. He had seen battle, just like she had. But there was something else, something she had never seen in a warrior before. Compassion. She should have hated it, should have rejected his help, but she was too weak, too tired. The human pulled a small water bottle from his belt and held it to her lips. She hesitated for a moment before taking a sip. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the best thing she had ever drunk. "What's your name?" the human asked. Serica hesitated. Names were not something shared between enemies. But she was dying. Did it really matter? "Serica." The human nodded. "I'm Daniel." Daniel. A simple name. A human name. He stood up and looked around. The battlefield was still empty. He sighed again, running a hand through his messy hair. I can't stay here long. If my squad finds me, they won't be happy about this, he muttered. Serica tried to lift her head. Then, go. Daniel shook his head. No, I'm not leaving you here. Serica didn't know what to say. A human was risking his life to save her. A Valkyrie, his enemy. For the first time in her life, she questioned everything she had been taught about humans. And for the first time, she felt something strange. Hope. Serica's body ached with every breath. Her vision was hazy, but she could still see the human, Daniel, kneeling beside her, checking his surroundings. His hands were tense around his rifle, eyes scanning the battlefield. She couldn't understand him. A Valkyrie would never risk their life for an enemy. They would never waste time helping a fallen soldier. And yet here was this human, tending to her wounds, refusing to leave her behind. Serica swallowed, her throat dry. You should go, she whispered. Daniel didn't even look at her. Not happening. He stood up, still watching the horizon. Smoke rose from the distance, and the faint sounds of battle echoed in the air. If his squad or her people found them, it wouldn't end well for either of them. Serica gritted her teeth. You're making a mistake. If my people find you, they'll kill you. If your people find you, they'll think you're a traitor. Daniel glanced down at her, a small smirk on his face. Yeah, well, I've made worse mistakes before. She didn't know if he was joking or not, but there was no fear in his voice. Only determination. Serica shifted, trying to sit up, but pain shot through her ribs like fire. She gasped, her arms trembling. Daniel immediately knelt beside her. Hey, don't move. You'll tear the wound open again. She clenched her jaw, frustration boiling inside her. I'm not weak. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I never said you were. She looked away, embarrassed. Among the Valkyrie, strength was everything. She had never needed help before. She had never been this helpless before. She hated it. Daniel sighed and reached for his backpack. You need to rest. I have some supplies, but we can't stay out in the open. If either of our sides find us, we're dead. Serica frowned. We? Daniel looked at her. Yeah, you think they're gonna thank me for saving you. My squad sees me with a Valkyrie. I'm as good as executed. Serica hadn't thought of that. Humans and Valkyrie had fought for years. There was no trust between them. If Daniel's own people caught him helping her, they would assume he was a traitor. Why are you doing this? She asked again. Daniel hesitated. Then he sat down on a broken piece of metal, resting his rifle across his lap. Because I don't like leaving people behind, he said finally. Serica studied him. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes. A shadow. A memory. You lost someone, she guessed. Daniel let out a short, bitter laugh. Yeah, a long time ago. He didn't explain further, and Serica didn't ask. She knew what loss felt like. The battlefield took everything eventually. Friends, family, honor. Daniel shook his head and stood up. We need to move. There's an old bunker not far from here. If we're lucky, it'll still have supplies. Serica frowned. You're taking me with you. Daniel crossed his arms. Unless you want to stay here and bleed out. She glared at him but said nothing. Didn't think so, he muttered. Daniel knelt beside her and carefully lifted her arm over his shoulder. Serica tensed, her pride screaming at her to push him away. But she couldn't walk on her own. She swallowed her pride and allowed him to help her. Each step was agony. The pain in her side flared with every movement, and she had to bite her lip to keep from groaning. Daniel moved slowly, keeping her balanced. They walked through the ruins, stepping over debris and bodies. The smell of fire and death filled the air. Serica felt weak, but more than that, she felt vulnerable. She had spent her life believing humans were weak, dishonorable. Yet here she was, being saved by one. And he didn't ask for anything in return. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bunker. It was half buried in rubble. The metal door rusted and dented. Daniel kicked it once, then again. With a loud creak, it opened. He helped Soraka inside, guiding her to a dusty corner where she could sit. Then he quickly searched the bunker, checking for supplies. Soraka closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her. Maybe she should hate him. Maybe she should try to escape. But she was too tired. And deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. For the first time in her life, a human had shown her kindness. And that changed everything. The bunker was cold and dark. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of rust and old metal. It must have been abandoned for years, but right now, it was the safest place they had. Daniel dropped his backpack on the floor and sighed. Not great, but better than the battlefield. Soraka sat against the wall, her breathing heavy. The walk had drained what little strength she had left. Her wound throbbed with every heartbeat, but at least she wasn't lying in the dirt waiting to die. She watched as Daniel moved around the bunker, checking crates and old storage lockers. His movements were quick, efficient. He was a soldier, just like her. Yet, everything about him was different from what she had been taught about humans. Soraka frowned. "Why did you bring me here?" Daniel didn't look at her as he pried open a rusted box. "Told you already. I don't like leaving people to die." She narrowed her eyes. "Even your enemies." Daniel pulled out a small metal can, shook it, and sighed. "Yeah, even my enemies." Soraka didn't understand him. The Vorkari never saved the weak. They never helped the fallen. If a human had been lying on the battlefield, her people would have left them to rot. "Your people wouldn't do the same," she muttered. Daniel finally turned to her. His brown eyes were calm, but there was something sharp underneath. "Yeah, I know." Soraka expected him to be angry, maybe even hate her for it. But he just shook his head and opened the can with a small knife. Inside was something that looked like dried meat. He tore off a piece and tossed it to her. "Eat," he said. Soraka caught it out of instinct. She sniffed it cautiously. It smelled strange, but she was too hungry to care. She took a bite and chewed slowly. It was tough, salty, and dry. But it was food. Daniel sat across from her, eating his own portion. For a while, they ate in silence. The only sound was the distant echo of war outside. Finally, Soraka spoke. "You said your squad wouldn't understand, that they'd think you're a traitor." Daniel chewed for a moment before answering. "Yeah." Soraka hesitated. "So why do it?" Daniel smirked. "You ask a lot of questions." She scowled. "I don't understand you." He sighed and leaned back against the wall. "You ever seen a battlefield after a fight?" Soraka gave him a look. "Of course." Daniel shook his head. "I mean really seen it. The bodies. The blood. Doesn't matter if they're human or Vorkari. When they're dead, they all look the same." Soraka didn't answer. She had seen death many times, but she had never thought about it that way. Daniel looked at her, his expression serious. "We fight because our leaders tell us to. We kill because we're ordered to. But at the end of the day, we're not that different." Soraka frowned. "We are different." "Are we?" Daniel asked. "You breathe, I breathe. You bleed, I bleed. You fight for your people, I fight for mine." Soraka stayed silent. Daniel chuckled. "You know, back on Earth, we have a saying. An enemy is just someone whose story you haven't heard yet." Soraka crossed her arms. "You think if we sit around telling stories, the war will stop?" Daniel shrugged. "No, but it's a start." Soraka wasn't sure what to say. She had spent her whole life training to fight humans, to kill them. And yet here she was, sitting in a bunker with one, sharing food, talking like they weren't supposed to be enemies. It was unsettling. Daniel stretched his legs. You should rest. You lost a lot of blood. Sareka hesitated, trusting the human was dangerous. But she was too exhausted to argue. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. Daniel stood up and grabbed his rifle. I'll keep watch. Sareka opened one eye. You don't trust me. Daniel smirked. Nope. She snorted softly. Good. As she drifted into sleep, one thought stayed in her mind. Maybe humans weren't as weak as she had been told. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as different from them as she thought. Sareka woke to the sound of distant gunfire. It was faint, muffled by the thick bunker walls. But it was there, a reminder that the war hadn't ended. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Pain flared in her side as she shifted, bringing reality crashing back. The bunker, the battle, the human. She turned her head and saw Daniel sitting near the entrance, his rifle resting on his lap. He was awake, alert, watching the shadows outside. You didn't sleep, she muttered. Daniel glanced at her. Didn't need to. Sareka frowned. Humans need rest just like Orcs. Daniel smirked. Yeah, but I don't trust you enough to sleep. She couldn't argue with that. If their positions were reversed, she wouldn't trust him either. Sareka tried to sit up, biting back a groan as pain shot through her ribs. Daniel noticed and reached for his backpack. Here, he tossed her a small bottle. She caught it weakly, eyeing the label. What is this? Painkillers. Sareka hesitated. Vorkari warriors didn't take painkillers. They endured. But right now, she wasn't a warrior. She was an injured soldier who needed to survive. With a sigh, she twisted the cap and swallowed a pill. Daniel watched her for a moment before speaking. I checked the supplies. We got enough food for maybe 2 days. Water's low. If we stay here too long, we're dead. Sareka nodded. Then we leave. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You sure you can walk? She glared at him. I'm not weak. He chuckled. You keep saying that, but I'm the one who dragged you here. Sareka's jaw tightened. This human was annoying. She forced herself to stand. The pain was still there, but it was duller now. Manageable. Daniel sighed. All right. If we move at night, we'll have a better chance of avoiding patrols. Sareka crossed her arms. Where are we going? Daniel hesitated. There's an old human outpost a few miles from here. If it's still standing, we might find a radio, maybe supplies. Sareka narrowed her eyes. And then, Daniel looked at her, and then we figure out what happens next. Sareka didn't like that answer. She preferred clear plans, direct orders. But she didn't have a choice. Right now, survival was more important than strategy. She took a deep breath. Fine. But if you betray me... Daniel laughed. Yeah, you'll kill me. Got it. She scowled. I mean it. He smirked. That's what makes it funny. She shook her head. Humans were strange. A dangerous journey. They left the bunker just as the sun began to set, moving carefully through the ruins of the battlefield. Smoke still rose in the distance, and the air smelled of burnt metal and blood. Sareka walked slowly, her wound aching with every step, but she refused to show weakness. Daniel stayed close, keeping an eye on their surroundings. They didn't speak much. There was no need. After an hour of walking, Daniel suddenly raised a hand. Wait. Sareka froze. What is it? Daniel crouched behind a fallen piece of wreckage and pointed. Vorkari patrol. Sareka followed his gaze. In the distance, 4 Vorkari soldiers moved through the rubble, scanning the area. Her people. She should have felt relieved. But instead, she felt something else. Unease. They're looking for survivors, she whispered. Daniel gave her a sharp look. If they find you with me, what happens? Sareka clenched her fists. She already knew the answer. The Vorkari didn't take prisoners. If they saw her with a human, they would assume she was a traitor. They'll kill us both, she admitted. Daniel nodded. Then we stay quiet. They crouched lower, waiting. The Vorkari patrol moved slowly, checking the bodies, gathering weapons. If they looked this way, it was over. Soraka's heart pounded. She had fought alongside warriors like them. If they found her, she would have to fight them. Could she do that? Could she kill her own people to protect a human? The thought made her stomach twist. Minutes passed. Finally, the patrol moved on, disappearing into the ruins. Daniel exhaled. That was close. Soraka didn't answer. She was still thinking about what she would have done if they had seen them. Daniel looked at her. "You okay?" She met his gaze. "I don't know." He nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. An uncertain future. They kept moving, walking through the ruins under the cover of darkness. The old human outpost was still miles away, but at least they were alive. As they walked, Soraka spoke quietly. "If we reach the outpost and find a radio, what then?" Daniel hesitated. "Depends. On what?" He gave her a small, tired smile. "On whether we can trust each other." Soraka didn't respond. She didn't know the answer. For now, all that mattered was surviving. But she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. This human had saved her life. And that changed everything. The night was cold, and the ruins around them were silent. Soraka and Daniel moved carefully, avoiding open spaces and staying in the shadows. The old human outpost was still a few miles away, but every step brought new dangers. Soraka's wound still ached, but she ignored it. Pain was nothing compared to what was at stake. She glanced at Daniel, who was walking slightly ahead, scanning the area with his rifle ready. She still didn't understand him. Humans and Vorkari had been enemies for years. They were supposed to hate each other. But Daniel had saved her life. Not once, but twice. And now, they were working together to survive. Could she really trust him? A tense encounter. They were moving along a crumbling road when Daniel suddenly stopped and held up a hand. Soraka froze. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel pointed ahead. In the distance, the ruins opened into a wide, empty street. At the far end, a group of human soldiers stood near a broken-down building. Soraka tensed. "Your people." Daniel nodded. His expression was unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Soraka narrowed her eyes. "Are you going to turn me in?" Daniel looked at her. "If I wanted to, I wouldn't have brought you this far." Soraka clenched her fists. She hated feeling uncertain. "Then what do we do?" Daniel thought for a moment. "We go around. Avoid them." Soraka studied him. He could have easily betrayed her, handed her over to his people. But he didn't. Slowly, she nodded. "All right." They turned and moved through a side alley, avoiding the open road. Whispers of doubt. As they walked, Soraka's thoughts raced. If Daniel was willing to betray his own people to help her, what did that mean? Was he a traitor to humans, or was he something else? She spoke carefully. "You said your people wouldn't understand if they saw you with me." Daniel sighed. "Yeah. Then why risk it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I don't care about the war anymore." Soraka frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel glanced at her. "I lost my squad a few months ago. Ambush. Vorkari attack. I was the only one left." His voice was steady, but there was something hollow behind it. Soraka didn't know what to say. She had lost comrades before. She knew that kind of pain. Daniel continued. "After that, I started asking myself, what's the point? We fight, we kill, but nothing changes. More people die, more battles, more graves. And for what?" Soraka looked away. She had never questioned the war before. It was all she had ever known. Daniel shook his head. "So yeah, maybe I should turn you in. Maybe I should hate you, but I don't." Soraka met his gaze. "Why not?" Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Because I've seen enough death. I'd rather save someone for once." For the first time in her life, Soraka didn't have an answer. Danger in the dark. They kept moving, but the silence between them was different now. Not hostile, not tense, just thoughtful. They were nearing the outpost when Soraka suddenly stopped. Her ears twitched, picking up a faint sound. Footsteps. Daniel noticed her reaction and immediately raised his rifle. What? Soraka scanned the darkness. Someone's following us. Daniel cursed under his breath. How many? She closed her eyes for a second, listening. Then she whispered, 3, maybe 4. Daniel nodded. Then we keep moving. Fast. They quickened their pace, staying low, but the footsteps behind them grew louder. Then, a gunshot. The bullet hit the wall inches from Soraka's head. She ducked, drawing her blade. Daniel spun around, raising his rifle. Run. Soraka hesitated. She didn't run from fights. But then she saw them. 4 figures in the darkness, moving fast. Vorkari soldiers. Her people. Her stomach twisted. If they saw her with a human, there would be no mercy. Daniel fired a shot, forcing the Vorkari to take cover. Go, he shouted. Soraka clenched her teeth but obeyed, sprinting toward the outpost. Daniel followed, covering their escape with gunfire. Bullets and plasma blasts lit up the night. The Vorkari were fast, closing the distance, too fast. Soraka reached the outpost first, slamming into the rusted door. She shoved it open and turned back. Daniel. Daniel was right behind her. Then he stumbled. Soraka's heart dropped. A Vorkari had tackled him from behind, pinning him to the ground. Another raised a rifle, aiming for his head. No. Without thinking, Soraka moved. She lunged forward, her blade flashing. Before the soldier could fire, Soraka struck. Her blade sank into his armor, piercing deep. The Vorkari gasped, eyes wide with shock. Soraka pulled the blade free, and the soldier collapsed. The other warrior turned in surprise, giving Daniel the chance to break free. He rolled, grabbing his own knife, and struck fast. The second Vorkari fell. The other 2 hesitated. Fall back, one of them barked. They vanished into the ruins, disappearing into the shadows. Soraka breathed heavily, her hands shaking. The body of the Vorkari she had killed lay at her feet. She had just killed one of her own people. For a human. Daniel got to his feet, wiping blood from his face. You okay? Soraka didn't answer. She wasn't sure. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. The air was heavy with silence. Soraka stood over the fallen Vorkari soldier, her blade still dripping with blood. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her like a boulder. She had killed one of her own. For a human. Daniel, breathing heavily, wiped sweat and dirt from his face. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. We need to move. Soraka didn't answer. Her mind was trapped in the moment. Flashes of the Vorkari soldier's face, the shock in his eyes, the way his body had crumpled. She had fought humans before. She had never hesitated to strike them down. But this was different. Daniel stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. Soraka, I know this is hard, but if we stay here, more will come. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. Focus. The war had taken many things from her. It had taken her home, her comrades, and now her certainty. With one final glance at the fallen soldier, she turned away. Let's go. The old outpost. The inside of the human outpost was dark and ruined. Broken crates and rusted equipment were scattered across the floor. The walls were cracked, and the smell of damp metal filled the air. Daniel moved quickly, searching through the wreckage. Help me find a radio. If we can send a signal, maybe we can get out of this mess. Soraka nodded, pushing her thoughts aside. She began searching, moving through the debris with practiced efficiency. Minutes passed in silence. Then, got it. Soraka turned. Daniel was holding an old, dust-covered radio. He wiped the screen with his sleeve and pressed a button. The device crackled. then fell silent. "Is it working?" she asked. Daniel frowned, adjusting the frequency. "Maybe. The signal is weak, but I can try boosting it." Sareka stood beside him, watching as he worked. This was it. If the radio worked, they had a chance to escape. But what then? If Daniel called for human reinforcements, what would happen to her? Would she be a prisoner? Would they kill her on sight? She wasn't sure. And for the first time in her life, she feared what would come next. A difficult truth. As Daniel worked, he spoke without looking at her. "Back there, you saved me." Sareka crossed her arms. "I didn't do it for you." He glanced at her, a small smile on his lips. "No." She scowled but didn't answer. Daniel turned back to the radio. "It means something, though. You made a choice, one your people wouldn't understand." Sareka stiffened. He was right. If the Vorkari learned what she had done, she would be labeled a traitor. But wasn't she one already? She had fought beside a human, saved him, and now she was helping him escape. Sareka exhaled sharply. "I don't know what I am anymore." Daniel looked at her, his expression softer than before. "Maybe you're just tired of the war. Like me." She didn't respond. She didn't know if she could. A desperate message. The radio crackled again, and Daniel quickly adjusted the settings. "Come on, just work." Finally, a weak signal came through. A voice. "This is Captain Harris of the UEG Recon Division. Identify yourself." Daniel grabbed the receiver. "Captain, this is Sergeant Daniel Carter. I'm alive, but in hostile territory. I have a wounded ally and require extraction." There was a long pause. Then, "Sergeant Carter, you're alive." Daniel exhaled in relief. "Yeah, I need pickup. Now." Another pause. Then Harris's voice returned. "We can send a dropship, but there are hostiles in the area. Who's the ally?" Daniel hesitated. His eyes flicked to Sareka. She held his gaze, her stomach twisting. This was it. If he told the truth, everything could change. Finally, he spoke. "A survivor, one of ours." Sareka's eyes widened. Harris didn't question it. "Understood. Dropship en route. Be ready in 20 minutes." The signal cut out. Sareka stared at Daniel. "Why did you lie?" He leaned back, rubbing his face. "Because if I told them you were Vorkari, they'd shoot first and ask questions later." Sareka narrowed her eyes. "And what happens when they see me?" Daniel sighed. "I don't know, but I'll figure something out." She didn't like that answer. She hated uncertainty. But she had no choice. For now, she would trust him. One final threat. The outpost fell silent again. Only the distant sounds of battle echoed through the ruins. Sareka checked her weapon. "We should move to a better position. If your people are coming, we need to be ready." Daniel nodded. "Agreed." They stepped outside, scanning the dark landscape. The wind was cold against their skin. Then Sareka's ears twitched. Something wasn't right. She grabbed Daniel's arm. "We're not alone." A shadow moved in the ruins ahead. Then another. Figures emerged from the darkness. Vorkari soldiers. At least 6. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His eyes locked onto Sareka's. "I thought I recognized that signal," he said coldly. "Sareka of the Vorkari Legion. What are you doing with a human?" Sareka's grip on her weapon tightened. Daniel tensed beside her. "Friends of yours?" She didn't answer. She already knew what was about to happen. The leader sneered. "You should have let us find you earlier. We would have brought you home." His gaze darkened. "But now you stand with the enemy." He raised his rifle. "You are no longer Vorkari." Sareka's pulse pounded. There was no turning back now. Daniel raised his own weapon. "Guess that means we fight." Sareka exhaled slowly. This was the moment. She had made her choice. Now she would face the consequences. The wind howled through the ruins as Soraka faced her former comrades. 6 Vorkari soldiers stood before her, weapons raised. Their leader, a tall warrior with battle-scarred armor, looked at her with cold eyes. "You stand with the enemy," he said. "You have betrayed your own kind." Soraka gripped her blade tightly. She had known this moment would come. Ever since she had saved Daniel, ever since she had fought alongside him, she had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Beside her, Daniel raised his rifle. His breathing was steady, his expression calm. "Looks like talking won't work." Soraka exhaled sharply. "No, it won't." The leader of the Vorkari squad raised his weapon. "Then you will die with the human." The battle began. The last fight. The first shots rang out, lighting up the night. Soraka moved fast, dodging to the side as plasma blasts hit the wall behind her. Daniel fired, taking down one of the soldiers before rolling behind cover. The Vorkari advanced, their heavy armor making them nearly unstoppable. But Soraka knew how they fought. She had trained with warriors like them for years. She sprinted forward, her blade flashing in the dim light. She ducked under a rifle swing and struck, cutting deep into an enemy's side. The warrior fell, groaning in pain. Daniel fired again, hitting another soldier in the chest, but the remaining 3 were closing in. The leader snarled, "You have chosen death." Soraka blocked an incoming strike with her blade, then countered with a swift kick. The soldier stumbled, but another one grabbed her arm, trying to pin her down. Daniel saw the struggle and didn't hesitate. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the attacker's head, sending the Vorkari sprawling. Soraka nodded at him. "Thanks." "No problem," Daniel said, reloading his weapon. Now only 2 enemies remained. One was wounded. The leader stood firm, his weapon steady, his expression furious. "This is your last chance," he growled. "Return with us. Stand down." Soraka met his gaze. She had already made her choice. She didn't answer. Instead, she charged. A final decision. The leader barely had time to react. Soraka was faster, her blade slicing through his defenses. He blocked one strike, but she spun, delivering a powerful slash across his chest. He gasped, falling to one knee. Blood dripped from his armor. The last soldier hesitated, looking between Soraka and Daniel. Then, without a word, he turned and ran into the darkness. Soraka let him go. She turned to the leader, who was breathing heavily, his hand clutching his wound. He looked up at her with a mixture of anger and something else. Disappointment. "You were one of us," he whispered. Soraka's grip on her blade tightened. "I still am," she said softly. "But not like this." The leader's gaze darkened. "Then you are nothing." With his last strength, he reached for his weapon. Soraka moved first. A single, clean strike. The leader slumped to the ground, his weapon falling from his hand. His eyes stared up at the sky, empty. It was over. The dropship arrives. Soraka stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. She had fought many battles before, but this one felt different. Daniel walked up beside her. "You okay?" She wiped her blade clean. "No." He didn't push her for an answer. Then, in the distance, the sound of engines roared through the air. Daniel looked up. "They're here." A bright light cut through the darkness as a human dropship descended from the sky. The heavy thrusters kicked up dust as it hovered just above the ruins. The side door opened, and a soldier inside waved them over. "Sergeant Carter, let's move." Daniel turned to Soraka. "Are you coming?" Soraka hesitated. This was it, the moment where she truly left her old life behind. If she stepped onto that ship, she would no longer be a Vorkari soldier. She would be a traitor. But if she stayed, she would die. She met Daniel's gaze. This human had saved her life. He had given her a choice. She took a deep breath. And then, she stepped forward. A new beginning. Inside the dropship, The human soldiers glanced at Soraka with suspicion. One of them whispered, "Why are we bringing her?" Daniel heard it but ignored them. He led Soraka to a seat and sat beside her. As the ship lifted off, leaving the battlefield behind, Soraka stared at the world below, the place where she had been born, the place she had fought for. Now, it was just a memory. Daniel nudged her. "So, what now?" She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I don't know." Daniel smirked. "Well, we'll figure it out." She looked at him, then out into the stars. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what came next. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing.